I recently had a conversation with one of my clients who was feeling a little discouraged after getting an annual performance review that suggested that he grow in charisma as a leader. And he was pretty overwhelmed at the idea of growing or improving in that area. And the conversation that the two of us had together was so rich that I really wanted to share some of this with you too. Because the good news is research shows we can actually grow in perceptions of charisma. So stay tuned to find out 3 ways that you can become a more charismatic leader. Hi there, welcome to People Ops Problems. I'm LeAnne Lagasse, and today we are talking all about charisma. But even the word charisma carries a lot of connotation, does it? So what exactly is it, and then how do we grow in it? Well, the word itself comes from the Greek word charis, meaning gift or grace. And so essentially, people who are viewed as very charismatic are individuals that have a magnetic appeal. Others are attracted to them. They know how to inspire and move others to action. And really, they're viewed as both competent, right, and warm. There's something about them that makes other people want to be around them. I like to think of charisma as the place where effective leadership and really phenomenal communication intersect. And the good news is that we can get in the reps in these areas. We can grow in perceptions of charisma. But before we jump in and talk about some practical tips and strategies, a passionate disclaimer. You do not have to be a charismatic person to be a very effective leader. Sure, it helps, but it's absolutely not necessary. In fact, I bet if you think back to some of the best leaders you've had, some of maybe even the best educators that you've had, you'd probably say some of them were charismatic and others not so much. But the thing is that leaders can get to the same outcomes using different methods. So if you are sitting here watching this video and you're wishing that you could grow in charisma, the first thing I want you to know is it's possible to grow in charisma, but secondly, it's not mandatory to be an effective leader that you be perceived as charismatic. You can get to the same outcomes using different methods. No question, if you're in leadership, you're in the business of influencing others, but you can influence others through the natural talents and strengths that you have, whether that's through building relationships or thinking strategically, right? Or critically, or mobilizing other people, or how you make things happen and execute things. So don't beat yourself up if you don't feel like you're naturally charismatic. You can grow in this, but also you don't have to be the most charismatic leader. Okay, I'll step off the soapbox now. Let's talk about some practical strategies that you can use to grow in charisma. Okay, so the first way that you can become a more charismatic leader is to own who you are and who you aren't. Because the most charismatic people are those who are comfortable in their own skin. They show up bringing energy to interpersonal encounters that says, I know who I am and I know who I'm not. It's so rare, actually, that people carry that kind of energy around in their professional interactions that it will make you stand out if you can get your mindset right. So part of this process is coming to terms with who you are and who you aren't. Some questions that I recommend that you ask to just get yourself started on this kind of mindset shift journey is, 1, where do you bring the most energy in your professional work? What do you do with the most ease, excellence, and enjoyment, right? Where do others seem to affirm your giftings and your talents and your strengths? Can you then describe those things in very concrete terms? Can you get comfortable talking about the areas where you bring value? Not to puff yourself up, not to sound arrogant, but to sound secure in who you are. And in the same way, can you get comfortable talking about who you aren't around other people, right? Not necessarily in a self-deprecating way, but in just a very factual way. This is where I bring value. This is actually where I don't bring value. Again, it's so rare that you'll be perceived as much more charismatic if you get comfortable about who you aren't in addition to who you are. So here are a couple of questions you can ask on this one. Where do I struggle to bring value in my professional role? Which parts of my job are the most difficult, right? Where do I struggle to get the relational outcomes that I really want? And then can I get comfortable talking about those things with those that I lead, those that I work with, maybe even those that I report to? So this one really is all about becoming comfortable with who you are. This is not to say that, oh, well, this is just a weakness and I guess I'll never improve in it. It's more to say, hey, who I am at this point in time in my career, this is the value I bring, this is where I'm learning and growing, or this is where I don't bring a lot of value because of the other natural talents and strengths that I have. So try this. In the next week, try to watch and listen for some organic opportunities where you can talk openly about your strengths and your weaknesses. Be as concrete as you can, be as specific as you can. And I'm telling you, watch the way that people respond to you. Watch the conversation that emerges from your self-disclosures, because it's so rare that leaders really take ownership of both their strengths and their weaknesses. Okay, the second way that you can become a more charismatic leader is, oh my God, this is so easy. This is such an easy one, and that is be curious about people. The all-time great Dale Carnegie, author of How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is 100% a book you have to read if you haven't already, said it this way: you can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. It's that whole to be interesting, be interested bit, right? The more you are curious and interested in other people that you're having these interpersonal encounters with, the more you are going to be perceived as charismatic. This is great news because we can all do this very easily. It maybe takes a little bit of planning to identify some, conversation topics or some questions we want to ask. But here's a couple of tips that I want to give you for how to get more curious about people in a way that increases their perceptions of your charisma. So the first thing I would say is, don't ask boring questions. Don't ask run-of-the-mill questions that everybody asks. Ask quirky questions. Ask cool, novel questions. Here are a couple that I heard just recently that I'm always listening for these things. And here are a couple that I heard recently that I thought, hey, that's a quirky or cool question. So number one, how about this one? If you had to give a speech with no preparation and it was a 30-minute long speech, right? What topic would you choose and why? Here's another one that I heard the other day. Somebody asked me that I logged as like a quirky question. They said, what's your go-to method for choosing the next television show or movie that you're gonna watch? And it was funny because when I first was asked this question, I thought, oh my goodness, that's so interesting. But surely everybody kind of has the same approach, but 100% we don't. So it led to a really fun conversation, right? That's the power of this, is using quirky questions that elicit self-disclosures. Because the more you can get somebody talking about things that are interesting to them, that are novel to them, that are, bring energy to their lives, the more they are going to find you favorable, and they're going to find you an interesting and a warm and a competent person. So ask quirky questions. Another one of my favorites is, hey, what's the coolest day of work that you've ever had? Because that's going to give people an opportunity to reflect on some of their successes, things that they feel positive about, and that builds really good goodwill between you and your conversational partner. So imagine that you're leading a team meeting or you're having a one-on-one with one of your team members. Instead of asking just, how was your week, right? Which, can communicate some good things for sure. Ask some quirky questions. What were the things that happened in the last week that brought you the most energy? Where were the things, or what were the things this week that brought you the least amount of energy, right? Ask quirky questions. You'll be perceived as much more charismatic if you do that. And then the second way that you can kind of be curious about people and communicate this to them in a way that builds perceptions of charisma is by actually listening to them, paraphrasing what they're saying, and then using that as an opportunity to elicit more self-disclosure, because self-disclosure breeds reciprocity. And when we reciprocate those disclosures in conversation, it builds perceptions of warmth and trust and liking, right? So paraphrase. Let's say I'm talking to one of my new direct reports and she's sharing a little bit about her work background. I'm listening actively. I might say something like, wow, it really sounds like you have a lot of experience navigating startup culture. Based on what you've learned, what are maybe your top 2 or 3 insights about what it takes to successfully navigate that kind of work environment? Because by doing that, I'm asking this individual to share their experiences, their insights. That again is going to build reciprocity in our conversation, and that leads to higher perceptions of charisma. So here's the thing, up to this point, number one is all about your mindset. It's you getting comfortable with who you are and who you aren't, and then talking about that. Number two is, of course, you getting curious about people and watching how they respond to you. That will take us into the third strategy, or the third tip, which is much more tactical in nature and is one of my very favorite things to talk about. And I wish I had like an hour more of video time that we could allot for it, but I digress. Let's talk about the third strategy. Okay, and the third way that you can grow in perceptions of charisma is to use non-verbally immediate behaviors. So if you're not familiar with that term, let's define it. Nonverbal immediacy is the ensemble of nonverbal communicative behaviors that reflect psychological availability, communicate affiliation and preference, and result in perceived interpersonal closeness. Okay, I know that is a little kind of academia of a definition. I like to think about nonverbal immediacy as psychological closeness. Perceived psychological closeness is another way that it's described in the research. So how is it that we can use our nonverbal behavior to communicate to other people that we are open and accessible and available and we want to engage in this conversation? That's all that we're trying to accomplish when we're thinking about nonverbal immediate behavior. So here are a couple of tips for you for how you can use your nonverbal behavior to be perceived as more nonverbally immediate, thus more charismatic, right? So the first thing I would say is your eye contact is so very important when it comes to nonverbal immediacy. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we may not be comfortable with eye contact or we may struggle with eye contact, but in general, the rule here is the more eye contact that you can make, the better. Now, I'm not talking about like creepy eye contact where you're not breaking and you're weirding people out and making them feel like you're, violating their personal space. I'm talking about purposeful, direct eye contact where there's energy between you and the person or the group of people that you're interacting with, right? There's directness there because of your eye contact. Another thing that you want to do nonverbally is to use open and expansive gesturing, right? So for example, public speakers who walk across the stage with their arms crossed are perceived as less nonverbally immediate, right? But that makes sense because they're closed off. Leaders who sit back in their chair like this, right, are going to be perceived as less nonverbally immediate. So the more that you can use open, expansive, and natural gestures, the better. Gestures are powerful. They help people process information. In fact, try this maybe with like your partner or your kids or your coworkers. Try to tell a story about something spatial, like maybe where you grew up or what your room looked like, and not use any gestures. It's very difficult to do because gestures are linked to our language. So the more that you can use them openly and expansively, the more charismatic that you're going to be perceived, okay? Another area of nonverbal communication that you want to be thinking about is your posture. The most charismatic people actually don't have the most rigid posture. Now, they have a strong posture, but they have a composure and there's a relaxed nature to the posture as well. So now, granted, this depends on different scenarios when you might need to be a little bit more, buttoned up, but in general, you want to have strong, good posture, but not rigid posture. And that comes back to some of that open, expansive, gesturing that we talked about. You want to look comfortable and you want to look composed, but having obviously strong posture as well. So on that note, another thing I would want to tell you about nonverbal immediacy is you want to have direct body orientation to the people or the individuals that you're interacting with. And you also want to have an open body orientation. So again, you're not closing yourself up, right? You're open and expansive and direct. If you can do these things, you will be shocked at how much more charismatic you'll be perceived. And then the last category of nonverbal behavior that I want to talk about is your vocalics. This is the way that we use our voices to communicate. So if you're going to stand up in front of your team members and say something like, I'm really excited about next quarter and the goals that we have, Who's following you? Who's believing that, right? If you can't deliver your meetings, your conversations with energy and enthusiasm in your voice, you might as well expect that people are not going to perceive you as very charismatic. So this is an area where you could really grow if you focus on one of these areas at a time. Don't get overwhelmed by going, okay, I gotta have this posture and this gestures and this vocalics. Focus on one thing at a time. I would recommend starting with your voice because this is one that almost everybody can grow in pretty quickly. And then you can start thinking about your facial expressions and your gesturing and your posture and all that good stuff. But by focusing on non-verbally immediate behaviors, you are going to grow in perceptions of charisma. All right, there you have it. 3 ways that you can become a more charismatic leader. As always, thanks for being here. Make sure you like and subscribe and share and do all the things, and I'll see you next time.